morning. So these are my disclosures. And the learning outcomes today are that first, that we're able to identify therapy strategies for speech sound disorders that optimize the preschoolers' level of engagement and their level of performance. Next, we're going to look at how can we promote accurate production of speech sounds with multimodal cues based on placement, manner, and voice. And then lastly, we're going to look at how to increase and decrease scaffolding to provide a level of support that both encourages yet challenges the communication development for optimal gains. So this is going to be a really great course in which we delve really deep into the details that really make a difference in treating speech sound disorders. So the first thing we're going to look at is what we're going to cover today. These are 5 aspects of our therapy that really make a difference. And as you can see, the child is running up the stairs. There's a reason for that. These details that we're going to talk about today, they expedite the gains. So you're going to see gains more quickly. The gains are going to be in the same order. We don't change the order speech develops. Universally, in all the languages around the world, it's always going to be vowels, stops, fricatives, affricants, 2-element clusters, 3-element clusters. We're not going to change that. But what we're going to do is we're going to use strategies today that make the children run up the stairs and making progress. So the strategies I'm going to share with you today is are they going to make a difference in which the children that come to you with a severe level of impairment in the fall, many of them will be graduating by the end of the school year because there's a cumulative effect in which we did everything right and it all is going to add up. So today I'm sharing all of our secrets with you that really matter in maximizing gains. So let's start with the speech target. This is the biggest game changer for me. So about 10 years ago, before I was using more complex treatment targets, I would have a child come in at the standard score of 60, a severe speech sound disorder. Then by the end of the year, that score would be about 80. That was my typical, that I was happy about that. Those are great gains. That was my typical performance that occurred over a school year. Today, that's not the case. What I've changed is I use more complex treatment targets. And as a result, the child that's coming to me with 60, it's not about making gains anymore. It's about graduating. So at the end of the school year, I'm exiting them from services. So this has been a really big game changer, and I'm going to spend some time on it because it's so important and the details matter a lot. So before I go into the details, I want to give you some background about how we found out that these details really matter. So in the beginning, I knew that clusters were important and that clusters brought better gains. I've heard it from Jennifer Taps, I heard it from Lynn Williams, but I really didn't know about the details and which clusters are more powerful than others, and are 3 elements more powerful than 2 elements. So we were just doing the best we could 10 years ago. So myself and Wayne State University graduate students, we had a program, and we would look at a child and their phonological processes. So for instance, if the child stopped fricatives, fronted velars, and glided L and R, we would say, let's work on SKR blends and get 3 for the price of 1. We're going to target 3 phonological processes, and within 5 sessions, we're going to see what would happen by just saying, can you scrape it to me, please? And that's the only word that the child's going to say throughout. Or other students were like, I see a child that's stopping and gliding. I want to use the verb, can you slide it to me, please? And I'm like, that sounds good. Would you like to use, can you splash it to me instead and have SPL? And the graduate student would say, not really, because I really want to focus on the S and the L, and I only have 5 sessions. Another graduate student would say, I do want to use SPL. I see that would be acrobatics in the mouth, and that would improve the overall oral motor coordination. So we just did what we thought was best. We knew what the research was. We knew that we were combining an obstruent, the S, with a sonorant, the L. So we knew that was good. That was acrobatics in the mouth, combining an obstruent with a sonorant. They're maximally distinct. We didn't know, is it better to do SPL or is it better to do SL? We did not know at that time. So we documented what was the treatment target we used. What did we find? We found that S blends, 2-element S blends, were much more effective at improving outcomes than Wheeler K and G blends, than F blends, than TH blends, who came in dead last. So the S blends were highly effective at improving outcomes. They made the greatest gains. But then we wanted to take it a step further, and we looked at, what about the 2-element S blends versus the 3-element S blends? What happens when we compare those? And what did we find? The 3-element S blends had much greater gains than the 2-element S blends. We're talking more than double, almost double the gains than the 2-element S blends did. So it is much better to use SPL splash than slide. We didn't know that at the time. We were in the dark. Only after we gathered our data on 76 different preschoolers of diverse etiologies did we realize that across the board, we're talking children with autism, children with Down syndrome, children with cognitive impairments, children with just mild distortion errors. The ones that had the 3-element blends had much greater gains than those that had the 2-element blends. So we were in the dark and doing the best we could. And only after we looked at the data did we make these conclusions that S blends, the Celine Dion of the blends that are an influencer and very popular in a popular spot in the mouth, are very hot. They're going to give you great gains. But B, we also learned 3-element blends are going to give you much better gains, almost double the gains than 2-element S blends will. So what have we learned? I like to compare it to poker. So we learned that 3-element S blends beats 2-element S blends. So a cue such as SKW or SKYA, that was much more powerful than SL. So we learned 3, even if it's 3 of earlier developing sounds, was really beating out in gains 2-element clusters. That's one thing we learned. Now, this is where things get interesting. What about if the goal was 2-element clusters? What would be better, to work on a 2-element cluster in therapy or a 3-element cluster? What if our goal was for the child to say slide, SL blends? Well, what we found is, I'm going to bring out my garden hose, that it was not laterally generalizing. So if we worked on SL in therapy, 2 weeks later, we were not seeing gains in the 2-element clusters. So speech does not generalize, or at least over the short term, like a garden hose. How does it generalize? Like a waterfall. So when we worked on the 3-element blends, then we saw gains on the 2-element clusters in testing. So as I said before in my song, I said, don't go at it. That won't transfer. Must go over it. That helps everything. So we're looking at that, and let's see the next step. What about consonant clusters or affricates? Are affricates not consonant clusters? After all, if you think of an affricate, you have d, j put together, or you have t, sh put together. It's not a consonant cluster, and the reason for that is they're co-articulated. Let me explain. If we made the sound ch as in cheese, let's say it together, ch. Notice that the airflow comes out with the palatal sh. You don't say ta, sh. So you don't fully articulate the T. You release the T's airflow with the sh. The same thing happens with da. You don't say with ja. You don't say da, ja. You say ja. And you release the airflow with the ja. So they're co-articulated. When you're looking at 2-element clusters, however, you say both of them. You fully articulate both of the clusters. So they are more complex. Now, this surprised me in the research. I wanted to look at the affricates. If I wanted to improve affricates, ch, ja. And those are very protracted in the mouth. Ch, ja. Think about that. Skra is very retracted. What would improve affricates? What we found. 2-element S-blends beat affricate goals. So once again, if we worked on an affricate in therapy, 6 weeks later, it really wasn't improving the affricates in testing. However, if we took it up a level and we worked on 2-element clusters in therapy, it was improving the affricates. What if we worked on 3-element clusters in therapy? That's when we saw great improvement with the affricates. So this was a surprise to me. I had to look at my data of 76 different preschoolers, and I had to say, okay, they said scrape here, and they said ja here. They said, can you juice it to me? Or I forgot the words that they would use. And I had to say, wow, when they did SKR, which is nothing like cha and ja, that's when you got the big gains on cha and ja. So that was a surprise to me. But what I do when I do my research is I don't look at the numbers until the very end of the study, because confirmation bias is real. If I believe that 3-element clusters beat affricates, which I did not believe when I did the study, then I would have the placebo effect. Then I would look for evidence of that. I waited until I had the data on all 76 children before I analyzed it. So let's look at let's look at the next area, just like poker. So we know that what wins, affricates or singletons, then we're going to have the affricate win. So you can compare it to if you have a king and a 2, and you have a king and an ace, what's going to win? The affricate is. Okay, so even though it's not a pair of kings, it's got a higher card. It's more complex. So we also looked at affricates versus singletons, and affricates gave better gains than the singleton sounds did. So once again, our research showed the higher you aim, the higher the gain. And we also showed that it does not transfer like a garden hose. What you work on in therapy will not necessarily generalize at the same level. It does transfer like a waterfall with a cascading effect. So let's look at what else wins. If we look at a later developing sound or an earlier developing sound. So if you want to improve pa, ta, da, na, ka, the stops, we're not going to work on the stops in therapy. We're going to work on a higher level sound like an affricate. And then once again, we're going to have the cascading effect. So the later developing sounds are better treatment targets than the earlier developing sounds. So we know about the complexity approach. Speech does not develop like a geyser in which you work on a simple treatment target and you have gains that move in an upward fashion. That just doesn't work that way. It also doesn't work like a garden hose, at least in the short term, where you work at the same level and it generalizes to the home and in the classroom, in the testing environment. It works like a waterfall. So what I'm going to show you next is very important because we don't want to judge the child when it comes to choosing a treatment target. Don't underestimate what a child's capable of, and don't underestimate what you're capable of. When it comes to selecting a treatment target, what we care about is what the child could do. I'm getting my toolbox out. If you emptied your toolbox out and helped the child with all of the tools available to you. So in your toolbox, Everyone's toolbox is different. You might be trained in prompt. You might be trained in LSVT, these evidence-based approaches. You might know Kaufman. Izzy does it for apraxia, lively letters, fast approach. You might have tons at your disposal in helping children better perceive and produce sounds. Use everything in your toolbox as a starting point to see how high you can take this child, because we know the higher the target, the higher the gains. So this is a child with Down syndrome who has global levels of impairment and who has severe speech impairment below the 1 percentile. When you look at her, what she can do independently, which is not what we base the treatment target on, she's deleting the final consonant in all of the words. She's deleting syllables. She's deleting cluster reduction. She's deleting sounds in the clusters. I'm not working on that. I'm going to go as high as she can go. And when I go as high as she can go, what's going to happen is she is going through the cascading effect, impact many sounds. And as you can see from her level of errors, she had a 35% improvement. This is very important. Why did I not say standard scores? If I would have reported standard scores, she would have been 1 percentile in the beginning and 1 percentile at the end. She would have been under 55 standard score in the beginning, under 55 standard score at the end. What does that mean? If a tree falls in the forest and no one sees it fall, it didn't happen. Those gains would not have happened if I reported them in standard scores instead of her number of errors. And what happens if you don't do that? You risk losing funding. It happens a lot. Give these kids a voice, and you want to report their improvements, not them compared to their typically developing age-matched peers. You want to show this child after 5 sessions made 35% improvement. That's huge. Don't cut their therapy. So we're going to look at this, and I want to also show you something neat that Taylor, the graduate student, did. If you look at children with Down syndrome, what they have is they have a smaller oral cavity and a normal-sized tongue. So what that tends to happen, they tend to talk the tongue protruded because their normal-sized tongue is in a smaller oral cavity. She wanted to retract that tongue and keep the teeth together, the snake and the cage. So how did she do that? She chose scrape and spew. And that way she could focus on keeping the teeth together and the snake in the cage. Brilliant. Way to go, Taylor. Way to think. I would have gone to SKW, but that wouldn't help. She couldn't see the teeth then. If she would have said, wash it to me, you couldn't see whether the tongue was behind the teeth and the snake was in the cage. I learned so much from the graduate students I work with. So let's look at this video clip of her, and it did help. It did reduce the protraction of the tongue by her focusing on the snake being in the cage. One last thing, you're probably wondering, why did she choose scrape and why did she choose skew as verbs? Because she did this consonant cluster screener and she found that this child can produce, even if it's just a little bit distorted, both scrape and skew. So she's like, I'm going to empty out my entire toolbox and we're going to do this together and you're going to perform at your optimal level. One last thing. She's working on SKR. She's working on SKYA. What gains did I see in testing? There's a lot of gains. She's no longer deleting the consonants at the ends of the words. She's no longer deleting the consonants in the clusters. She's no longer deleting the syllables. We didn't work on that. We worked on the highest level. But speech develops innately. We don't change the innate order that speech develops. We just expedite it. So what is she going to develop last? SKR. That doesn't develop to 7 years of age. We don't have 3-year-olds walking around able to do SKR. They're going to be able to do their stops, their fricatives, their affricates, They're three element, and R is really tough. It's at the top of the mountain. So let's look at this video clip here. And I think it's just a brilliant example of don't underestimate your client or yourself, and work at the highest level possible with the little time you have to truly create change.
Nice teeth together. Nice big smile. There you go. 8, 4. It to me. Teeth together. There you go. I love those teeth being together. Okay. You get to be the scientist and pour the acid, Miss Taylor.
Stories? Story?
Great job. Okay, you get to spray it in. Pour it in right on the top.
What do we get to do?
Whoa!
Have a seat.
It erupted! Is that cool? Yeah?
Awesome. So you see that number of errors. It's not on clusters. Those come last. It's on what is first. So she showed improvement in stop sounds, and she showed improvement in fricatives, and some improvement in affricates. She didn't show improvement in the clusters, except that instead of saying cown, she was saying quown. So she was no longer cluster reduction. She was instead gliding the L's and R's. So instead of saying bidge, she was saying widge. So that's how it all worked out. She's filling in those sounds. So let's look at the next effective strategy. I know I spent a great deal of time on the clusters, but the details really matter. And it's important that you're able to explain to parents, look, this is how it's developing. We're working on SKR. That's going to come last. That's at the top of the mountain. What we're seeing is the stop sounds are developing. Do you see how they're saying the ends of the words? Because speech comes in like teeth. It's innate. First come in the stops, then come in the fricatives, then come in the affricates, then come in the 2-element clusters, and lastly come in the 3-element clusters. By working on the 3-element clusters, we're just helping these children run up these stairs. But we don't change the order of speech development. It's important to explain that to parents because they could feel very dismayed, like he still can't do it. He still can't do the clusters. So it's important to explain how speech will develop. So let's look at complex language context next. Before we begin, I'm going to talk about children with autism spectrum disorder and the sentence strip. I do not use the sentence strip, I want. And let me explain why. We found in our research, children with autism spectrum disorder have a lot of difficulty with diphthongs. It requires a complex motor movement in which you say, I, in which you articulate the sound I while moving your articulators. We've also found that children with autism spectrum disorder have difficulty with the W sound. Once again, it's called a glide. So you're gliding your articulators as you're saying the W, literally. And it's also labial. And we found that children with autism spectrum disorder have difficulties with the W. So why try to teach them through talk with the door that is not available to them, that's locked? We're going to go through the side door. Let's go to the back door. So what we like to do instead is work, and this is in the book, look at as carrier phrase. And let's talk about why. So we know when we see children with vowels, longer sounds are easier for them to perceive. And then if they can perceive it, they can produce it. So when you hear children with autism develop speech, they're very vowelizers. So when they read this as because the vowels are long. Liquids are vowel-like. They're longer. So we're going to go and take the back door, even though that's their way of learning speech. So we'll take it and say, we're making the L, ka, ka. So you see how we're so dramatic about those stop sounds so that they are able to perceive them because they're like this. Stop sounds are so fast, and they're also very fine motor. Let's just say that. They're very, at the very end, a lot of them are very tongue tip and very labial, which are very hard for children with autism spectrum disorder, what we found. So let's talk a little bit more about why we use look at over I want. Language is a container of thought. The words really matter. This is a request. This is a comment. So what I find is by using this, guess what children, and let me just give you a little background. Amy Weatherby did wonderful research on the CSBS. And she said, it's nice if they request, but her research found that's not prognostic of great communication outcomes later on. What is? Comments. Comments are the golden apple. Look. So this is how I teach children to talk with autism spectrum disorder using this sentence strip. And what is the first thing they do? They start pointing and they start commenting about things all around them in the environment. Language is very powerful. It's a container of thought. I've noticed a huge difference in using look. So let's move on and talk about, can we improve? As you can see, I was treating speech and language when I used look at. Can we improve speech and language at the same time? Can we have our cake and eat it too? Our research, which is really exciting, is showing yes. So let me first show you a paragraph that I use for the children. This is a paragraph, and they have, on each sentence, they have scrape here, spray here, drop here, angry here. So it's all distributed out for each sentence. What I have the children do is memorize this paragraph. As a result of doing this, memorizing this paragraph, they're able to focus on the sounds and how to produce the sounds correctly. So the research indicates that less targets is better than more targets. We don't want the child to be concerned about what they're saying. We want them to be concerned about how they're talking. So I want my children thinking, am I making the snake sound? Is my tongue in the back of my mouth? Do I have angry dog teeth? So by doing that, we use the exact same target. And what the research shows is that generalizes. So if we look at an approach that's evidence-based, such as the REST approach from Patricia McCabe and colleagues out of University of Sydney, they use nonsense words. It generalizes. So we want to keep them the same. Now, what happens when these children practice this paragraph is they start using complex sentences spontaneously. So once again, we have a cascading effect. In therapy, we're working on paragraphs. Spontaneously in the home and in their conversational samples, they're spontaneously producing complex sentences and expanded sentences that include prepositional phrases. So let's look at embedding speech targets. I also like to use first, then, lastly, because, and that's because these are words that improve executive function. They provide an order in which people can better order their thinking and sequence their thoughts. Language is a container of thought. So I want them repeating those words over and over again. And when they do, it becomes automatic. And when it becomes automatic, they're better able to tell stories, and they're better able to understand stories. For our children with communication impairments, they have a mountain ahead of them. They're going to have a lot of academic and a lot of social challenges ahead just because they have a communication impairment. That comes with it. The ability to tell a story, the ability to describe what they're feeling and why they're feeling what they're feeling is a pivotal skill. So if I can have my cake and I can teach them that while I'm improving their speech sound disorders, hey, I'm going to do it. So let's look at the entire paragraph and what I think it did for my children with autism spectrum disorder. I can't really guess, but what I think it did is it improved their attention, their joint attention. I want to tell you a story about how this happened on accident. My greatest discoveries have all happened on accident. And I had a graduate student, and I was working on the sentence strip with a child, look at animals, and he was barely verbal. He's minimally verbal. He probably had 5 words in his vocabulary, expressive vocabulary. And I'm like, hey, want to jump in? Let's tag team. Okay, you do the next one. And she picked up the paragraph. She did unknowingly. And what she did is she did continuous vocalization, and she had the child read the entire paragraph with her. And you know what? As an object in motion stays in motion. So that child just kept going. So she was reading with him. First, and I'm just like watching in disbelief as I'm seeing this child that probably has a vocabulary of 5 expressive words say an entire paragraph with her. And that changed my practice. And I said, okay, if we can say a sentence, let's just keep going and let's just say a paragraph. And what happens is, I think this is what happens, is it improved attention. So a lot of my children, when I began working with them in the fall, they're so sensory dysregulated that they're looking to the left and looking to the right, looking out the window. And just you and me, joint attention, we're focusing on this long paragraph together. Something special happens, and there's a cascading effect. And then you see improved language, improved joint attention, improved commenting, improved speech. Let me show you what happened. So I'm so excited about this, and I write about this in my book. So some of the best things that have happened by accident. Thank you, Becca, for changing our practice. So I started using the paragraph as soon as possible with children who were developing speech. And what happened is the type token rate, the number of different words they used increased by 8%, which is great. And then you look at these other gains here, which are also quite incredible. The mean length of utterance in a 6-month period improved by 25%. That's huge. And the commenting, the social communication. Remember, that's the golden apple. The commenting is everything. If a child can comment, oh, it looks so great ahead. We see great things for you ahead. Commenting is everything. It's the golden apple. Look at the increase in commenting for these children. So what caused all of this? I really think the joint attention in that we focus on an entire paragraph together instead of just 3 words. So thank you, Becca, for changing my practice and the great gains we saw. Now, these are 9 children that I studied. So looking at their speech, I can have my cake and eat it too. Look what happened. 40% improvement on the CAP on these test items. So they had 40%, more items correct. The percent conversant correct in speech, which is good because this is conversational speech, 48% improvement. This is in a 6-month period. I'm drooling talking about this. But that's what I'm saying is we can have our cake and we can improve our language, we can improve social communication, we can improve speech too through challenging the child in speech and in language. So let's look at this. Mary Lynn was ahead of her time because she was working with this child with autism spectrum disorder. And this child was highly distractible. So she would look at me, Miss Kelly! Every time she looked at me, 1 second later, like she's saying me for the first time. And I'm pleased to report today she's in elementary school. She has lost the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. But Mary Lynn was brilliant because she wanted to improve the utterance length, increase it, so she could increase her attention. Because Mary Lynn saw that, whoa, she would look at her ponytail, whoa, this is new. And she was so distractible. So Mary Lynn thought, why don't I have her say this long target, as you can see at the top of your right corner, and that'll increase her joint attention because we're both focusing on it together. What you're also going to see in this clip, which is extremely important, is motor imitation. When children with autism engage in motor imitation, their mirror neurons light up, double what they would normally be. So I always say, if you want to improve social communication, focus on that motor imitation. And as I mentioned before, how do children play with other children? Motor imitation. They imitate what other children do. So let's look at this great, fantastic clip.
Yeah. Let me see those sparkle fingers. You teach me because you're so good. Ready? 10,
blue one.
U.
Okay, now let's circle. I don't know. Blue might know where. We'll see. Circle number 3.
It.
Oh no. Hey.
To. Me.
You know what, Mark? I don't think blue is going to work. Let's do green. Ready?
I love the way your teeth were together there for that buzz sound. I am a cool girl because teeth together. There we go. Keep it in there. Big smile, big smile.
No, we're not going to eat.
There we go. I have
Which blue should we pop next?
teeth. You're such a rude girl sticking your tongue out at me. You get another turn, Stella. Here you go. Roll the dice. Roll the dice.
Mr. Ducky, you want to help us?
What number did we get? Number 3.
He has to learn our magic words.
Is that
okay?
number 3?
Ready? Let's see the nice
You're so
loud.
good
I
at
love
this
how
game,
you're saying
Estella.
You are. You're the best counter. You're teaching me. 1, 2, 3 sandcastles. Where's number 3?
It to
Where do you see number 3?
Whoa.
Oh, that's number. That's silly. There we go. One goes right
Wow.
here. This is such a great picture, Estella. 1,
Are you sure you're ready?
2,
Are you sure? Yeah, there you go. Let's
3. Perfect. Awesome, Estella. Are you ready for another turn?
we're in a
So that is what we're looking at in that clip. And as you can see, she made great gains in speech sound disorders as well. Is it going to be on the clusters? No, it's going to be on the stops. It's going to be on the fricatives. It's going to be on the affricates. The clusters and the R sound come last. So now we're going to look at activity-based intervention. Let's use real activities, engaging activities for learning to occur. So I'm going to hold here an apple, and this is an apple too. Okay, so this one I downloaded from the internet, and this is a real apple. The one I downloaded from the internet, I put Velcro on the back, and I laminated it. At the end of the day, it's just a dressed up flashcard. When children experience it, it's through one sense, the visual sense. When children experience a real apple, it's multisensory. So when we have a real apple, there's visual, there's the smell, there's the taste, there's the feel. So whenever possible, use real objects for these children because they're experiencing this for the first time and their neurons are making connections at millions of times a second. Use the real thing. I know that a lot of people, I think, start believing that it's three-dimensional when they put binders on it, when they put ringlets on it, when they put Velcro on it, and they put laminate on it. It's still a flashcard. It still only hits one sense, okay? Just to keep that in mind, use real objects whenever possible. So let's get into activity-based intervention. So I talked about the multisensory engages all of the senses by using real objects and real experiences. And when we do that, the information is more efficiently encoded and stored. So if I learned about this apple through all of my senses, I'm going to learn much better about the apple than only through visual, okay? Now, children, this is my most important thing. I don't think our field talks enough about emergent learning. It matters whether the activities are fun. Children who love learning will go on to learn more. We talk about emergent literacy. We understand that children who love reading will go on to read more. So it's really important to treat the books like a toy, and the experience of reading is so important. That's equally true for learning. And there's a lot of research to support it, just as much research as emergent literacy. So when I evaluate an activity at the end of the day with an intern or by myself, I'm like, my number one question is, how fun was that? Because if that activity was really fun, I know that child's dopamine levels were elevated. And I know as a result, that child learned that information more quickly and more memorably. That child's going to remember it. So fun is so important. People come into my therapy room and they're like, this looks like a carnival in here. I'm like, yeah. It's funny, I work with an occupational therapist, and he does movement activities, and I sometimes will be like, my movement activity is more fun than yours, more fun than yours, more fun than yours. So that's super important. Yeah. The next thing we're looking at is activity-based intervention improves outcomes. So what we know is that if the play is purposeful, if there's goal-directed, as we talked about before, narratives and science experiments and task-oriented movement activities in which we have something to do, that directly improves executive function. So this is going to produce better language outcomes long term. I told you in the last session, I'm talking to all of these people at the elementary school level, and they're like, the problem is executive function. If we don't have these foundational skills, we can't go and learn these higher level speech and language skills. We need executive function for that to happen. So that's what activity-based intervention provides. Also, using natural rewards is more powerful than non-natural rewards. It's one thing to say, what's this? Apple. It's another thing to say, what's this? Apple. And they receive the apple. When they receive the apple, they remember it. So this is particularly true with children with attention deficits and children with autism spectrum disorder. Receiving the natural reward is going to promote gains at a much higher level than simply having a neutral reward presented in sort of a labeling activity. So use the natural rewards for quicker gains that are more memorable and more long-term. So we're going to look at this blending exercise, a blending exercise. In my book, in one of the chapters, I talk about how we use literacy and treat it in speech sound disorders. And we look at about 10 different phonological awareness skills. This one, blending, as we talked about before, is of crucial importance. Blending is such an important phonemic awareness skill, probably, as the research would suggest, the most important phonemic awareness skill, because what the child is doing is blending sounds together to create words. It makes perfect sense that a child that can blend sounds together to create words is going to be able to read better, is going to be able to write better. So this is a very important foundational skill. We like to use it with genie arms with the child because we've done research that finds that if you use gestures with phonemic awareness and phonological awareness skills, you're going to get much greater gains. So let's take a look at this, is which the natural reward is going to be the object after you blend it.
Let's see all your teeth. And growl angry. Your action. She'll lead the way. It's so dark in here. It's so dark. I hope she can find a way. Oh, be careful of the river in the
Whoa, you have such shiny teeth because I saw them all. Okay, Jeannie, let's unlock our next word.
Yeah, you're helping. I'm going to go.
Our next
Okay, in the bag it goes.
word has these sounds.
Put it in the bag. What nice team. Oh, through the tunnel. Okay, finish our graph.
What do you think it is? Feather.
Right.
Okay, do you think the feather is going to be for loud? Okay, let's get our shaker out, Jeannie. All right, Jeannie, let's try it. Shake, 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 shake.
Play. Okay, erase it. And I'll need your help to get everything out of the bag.
Yeah, I think so too. Nice categorizing. Was your prediction correct? It was. Okay, let's do our last step of our plan and check off our data.
Do you want to go there?
So once again, you can see how this improves executive function, the science experiment, where you have a problem, you don't know if it's going to be quiet or loud, and then you do an experiment and you test it and shake it out, and then after that, you check your data. Well, so let's look at, we're moving on up. You're doing a great job. Thank you for sticking with me on this. The next thing we're going to look at is dynamic, and I call it dynamic tactile temporal cueing. You're going to see it referred to as dynamic temporal tactile cueing. The reason I put tactile first is I can consider tactile a more obtrusive cue. It's giving more information when you touch than when you're using space in the air. So I like to label it first. So I like to say dynamic tactile, because that's more obtrusive, temporal cueing. So what are we talking about with dynamic tactile temporal cueing? As a starting point, we are going to exhaust every cue in our box. So this is how we begin, with the most prompting possible. That's our starting point. And why is that? By doing that, we can start as high as possible. I like Edith Strand's Collier workshop that I connected you to earlier, because she says, now I can give parents a prognosis, and I base that prognosis on what is the child able to do when I give them the highest level of prompting. And that will give me an idea of what kind of gains the child is going to make. So looking at incompatible cues, those are really important. When you make up cues, and I told you we all use different cues, and every graduate student you've seen has their own cues. What we think about is what's incompatible. So if we're thinking about L and it's rounded, like WAMP, if they have a big smile, they can't do that. You can't say WAMP with a big smile. So we'll have a big smile as a cue. Okay, now let's look at an R that's glided. You can't have angry dog teeth and growl and make a W. It's incompatible. It just can't happen. So we'll say, and let's look at when we want to make it quiet. So we know that if we look at our stops, voiceless stops are harder than voice stops, and that's because they're aspirated. So if the child is voicing a stop, for instance, instead of cat, they're saying gat, we can have them whisper. You simply cannot. It's impossible to voice it if you're whispering, because it turns the vocal folds off. So we'll say cat. They can't say gat if they're whispering. It's impossible. So these are incompatible cues that are really powerful to establish accurate production. And for the K and G, if you have a horseback, and your mouth is open, there's no way you can say T and D for K and G. It's impossible. It's incompatible. So that's what we always think about, is what cue is incompatible. In terms of manner, a lot of children have problems with stopping the S sound. So what we can do is continue the snake sound by saying, and they're saying, Nake, I don't hear a snake sound. I can't hear the snake sound, until they bring it. Oh, I still can't hear it. And then when they do finally make the snake sound, I hear snakes. They love that. They love scaring you. All right, so now we're looking at everyone benefits from dynamic tactile temporal cueing. We did research on children who just had mild distortion errors, and we found that if we did the dynamic tactile temporal cueing for saying the word rake, they said it much more clearly than if we just said say rake, and then they glided it. So these children who are really minor distortions benefit from it. And we also found that those children with very severe impairments benefited. So these children with the snake sound, where we're holding it for a very, 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 very long time for them to perceive it and join us, they're benefiting too. Dynamic tactile temporal cueing is simply an evergreen strategy, and we've done the research on 76 children of all levels of etiologies, all levels of severity, and they all do much better when you give them cueing using the body and space. So the secret is to maintain an 80% accuracy level, and always keep that in mind. If the child is saying, wait, stop, get those angry dog teeth in there. So you're always doing a dance with the child in which you provide more to keep them at 80% and pull back to keep them at 80%. It's dynamic. That's what makes it dynamic. It's moment to moment. So this is day one of dynamic temporal tactile cueing. This is maximum prompting. She's going to use tactile prompting. When we do tactile prompting, we have the child help touch themselves. We understand a lot of our children have proprioception difficulties, but we want to establish an internal locus of control in which the child is the teacher. So you're going to see her put his hands over there on day 1 of therapy.
You, nice big smile. Nice big smile. Right. Or pinch your cheeks. Pinch some more. There you go. Nice big smile. Right. It to me, please. Nice big smile. Louder, louder, louder. Oh, I love how that was nice and loud. There you go. You get to paint. Got it. Ooh, it's running.
Okay, so you get to see this maximum level of cueing. She is emptying the toolbox on day 1. She's using everything out there. You also get to see Taylor's really good at call-outs. Angry dog kid! So she doesn't stop the speech. She keeps the speech continuous and going, and she'll just give those little cues. A big smile. She's really great at that. Those are really effective too. So we're on to our last step, and this is scaffolding to promote an internal locus of control. And as I've said to you before, internal locus of control for me is everything. This is my why. Why do I do therapy? I'm here to change lives. I'm not here to improve a sound. I'm not here to improve morphemes. I'm here to change these children's lives. And how can we change these children's lives? By developing an internal locus of control in which they know and believe that their efforts matter. They can be successful with effort. Our children that we work with are going to probably have to work twice as hard or 3 times harder or 4 times harder than their neurotypical peers. They have to know that effort matters. They do not have a yellow brick road ahead of them in elementary school. Many of them have a mountain. If we can let them know at an early age that you are in charge of your success, that your efforts can pay off, they matter. You are the teacher. You are the CEO, not me. That's huge. So James Law did some important research where he looked at children at age 4, and these children with communication impairments, he looked at them in their 30s. Do you know what he found? He found they were more likely to have an external locus of control. They're more likely to think in the workplace, it doesn't matter what I do. It matters if my boss likes me. And their relationships, whether the relationship's going well or not, depends on whether you're married to your soulmate. For your parenting, it depends on how the child is. If the child's smart, or if they don't think they have control over that. We can change this early on. So let's look at the last step. What do? Fade the verbal model as soon as possible. This is so important. When we take that verbal model away, guess who has to do word retrieval and formulate the ideas? Guess who has to use their working memory and pull out the ideas and sequence them, work it? Guess who has to do the motor planning and decide where to put their tongue in their mouth, and the motor programming, how exactly they're going to make that happen? And guess who has to do the execution? The child. The child becomes the CEO. So if you get rid of that auditory cue as soon as possible, whether you're teaching speech, whether you're teaching language, whether you're teaching literacy, and DTTC allows you to do that, make the child the CEO. So the next thing we're going to look at is beginning with the end in mind. We talked about this before. We don't change the goalposts. We're using the exact same word. So the child can focus on how they're talking and mastering it. Can you imagine if you go to a piano teacher and every day he gives you a new song to learn? You can't master technique that way. Keep the target the same. And then beginning with the end in mind, we need frequency. Frequency matters. I tell parents to put the paragraph on their refrigerator and once every day practice the paragraph. That's been perfect. That's been the right amount of practice across my children. And then I have been able to, in therapy, focus on the how because they know the paragraph. They practice it every day. Begin with the end in mind. This is the last one here. Provide objective encouragement. So when children give me those angry dog teeth and they go, skirt, do you know what I do? Because I have angry dog teeth. You know what I do? I go, That's what I do. And what happens? The child makes the judgment. Why is Miss Kelly taking her hair and pretending it's ears and covering her ears with it? It's because I made angry dog teeth and I scared her. When they stick their tongue out in the rude boy tongue and say, teeth, I go, what? And I do that. And they have to say, why is she doing that? And they have to use their prefrontal cortex and take in the clues and figure out, it's because I stuck my tongue out at her and I made the rude boy tongue. So that's what we're talking about there. Beginning with the end in mind, we also want to space out the practice in a distributed learning format. The paragraph does that. You have a sentence, target, sentence, target. But also we have in our activities, we don't have the child sitting at a table for 30 minutes. Children preschool age, they need to move at least every 6 minutes. So if you are doing table time activities and it's a science experiment, you might have them get up and write on the board their data on a whiteboard and come back. Children need to move. They absolutely need to move to optimize attention. We've probably all been to those courses, those boot camps where you're doing burpees and jumping jacks and high knees and everything's messy. Form is messy. Let's distribute it and get better quality. So we're looking at this last video clip, and all I wanted to show you here, this is session 3. You saw session 1. Session 3, she's not talking anymore. He's the CEO. He's the teacher now. Internal locus of control.
Colors. You can have 1 or 2 colors. Which one would you like? 2. Red and blue. What color do you think they're going to make when they're combined? What do you hypothesize? Purple! You are right. Let's find out what kind of purple it is. If it's dark or if it's light. Okay.
Or it's shiny.
Or shiny, you're right. Okay, to put it in, you get to say your phrase like a teacher. Ready?
Can you
Nice words, Read it to me. Louder, louder, please. I can hear those bumblebees. I heard them. The bumblebees are coming. Ready? Scrape it to you. Okay, we have to.
Awesome. And this is the very end. Here they are, the teachers graduating from the speech summer program.
I won't say anything.
Can you scrape, spray, and drop it, please? Because
Okay, scare me.
I have angry dog teeth.
But 3 tongues, it was so scary. Awesome, you're working so hard. You're the teachers now.
Yeah. Okay, and to end this, I'm going to just say these are ineffective therapy practices, not fading the verbal prompt, using lots of different exemplars. Let's do 9 different SKR blends on this page. Then the child's going to focus on what instead of how, using little or no cues to establish correct sound production. We don't want to be in status quo. We want to see what the child's capable of at an optimal level to create change. Using only the mouth for cueing, staying seated throughout therapy, masked drill practice, and selecting simple speech and language targets because it doesn't develop like a geyser or even a garden hose. It develops like a waterfall. So I'm going to end this on a song for you. These are the 5. It's listed for you to practice and to see if they work in your program. Give it 8 weeks, see what happens. But my song for you at the very end is the kids' favorite song. Ready? Who is the teacher now? You. So go on and take this information and don't do what I do it better.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kelly. For the next 5 minutes, I'm going to see what questions we can get through. So Kelly, a couple people were asking about kind of home programs and home practice. And someone was asking, if there are complex targets that require significant cueing from an SLP, what do you send home for home practice? And do you have the parents practice every day, even if they're not cueing enough to get good accuracy from the child?
I love this question because this is hugely important, and this is why we pay attention to the distortions when we're keeping data every 8 weeks and testing the child, because sometimes we're finding this R that was mildly distorted has now turned into a W. And perhaps at the home environment, the parent is rewarding squape and saying, oh, at least he's reading it, that's so cute. So what I do is I have them read it and I send home a YouTube clip of me showing them the cues. So, and I make it very clear when I bring the child back, we're really focusing on the angry dog teeth, or we don't want to see this. So I just give the parent that focus, but I think that is such a wonderful question. We have to be very diligent to make sure that ear speech is not being reinforced at home, because just as practice makes perfect, practice makes imperfect. So I share a YouTube clip showing myself cueing them in therapy, very short. And I also, like I said, at the end of therapy, I'll say, I need you to focus on the snake in the cage. That's another one, lisping. It's huge. Keeping those teeth together. Okay, so that's what I have the parent do, is focus on those distortion errors. Great question. Awesome. So that they don't become habituated.
Great. And we had a couple people ask a similar question. Someone was noting that in traditional SSD intervention, there's often a step or an emphasis on the client being able to perceive the difference between the errored sound and the target sound, or looking at discrimination, essentially. Do you work on that? Do you skip over that and go right to production?
That's a great question, because we know from the research that when we have difficulty producing, we have difficulty perceiving. What I do at the preschool level, okay, and don't really focus on minimal pair therapy, and that's because for my taste, there isn't enough research to support it. That's based on case studies, and also at the preschool level, metacognitive skills are not very well developed. But I do activities such as my movement activities I'm doing right now, where we're comparing G and D animals. So the child in the movement activity, we have a goat. Is that a D sound, the drumming sound, da 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 da, or is that a goat? So I focus on the perception activities, which are very important, in my movement activities. I look at those common errors. Does it start with a W or an R? Whatever this activity is. And after they go through the movement activity with the animal, they'll put the whale in the W bin and the rock in the R bin when they're building an aquarium at the end. Great question. I do think that's very important.
Thank you. Someone was asking about with the clusters. She said it seems like the child needs to be stimulable, at least with maximum cueing, for all of the sounds that are in the complex blend. What if they are not stimulable at all for, say, R or K, or one of those sounds in the cluster?
Yes, I think that's a great question. And that's why we use a stimulability checklist, and we only pick clusters which the child moderately or mildly distorts. And we're seeing if we're able, with our full toolbox, we give it a little practice, we say this is a good target. If it's not, we shelf it. We don't work on a K that the child can't do. And a lot of children can't do K and G until about 4.5 years. Shelf it. Don't work on K and G. Work on L and R instead, the neighboring sounds. Okay? I love that question. We shelf those sounds and we work on sounds in which they're able to produce all three sounds accurately. I know that other people and other experts have said that they have to be able to produce the 2-element cluster and the S blend accurately in order to go to 3. But we've shown if you go right to 3, you're going to get better gains. We only have 30 to 60 minutes a week to work with these children, and our goal is to create change when neuroplasticity is at its highest level. So my program and my approach is more ambitious than what other experts have recommended.
Great. Thank you so much. There's some other questions, but we have run out of time. We always have to stop at 5 after in respect of everyone's time. But I wanted to let people know Kelly has provided her contact info there, which is very kind of you, Kelly. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Amy Nico, and thank you, speechpathology.com, and Kathleen. You've been wonderful, and thank you so much for being here.